Kazinvest invests in Asia, Africa, and a little bit in the US now. We do private equity in Asia, private credit and blended finance in sub-Saharan Africa, including Uganda, and also looking at venture studio opportunities with NCEE, Tracy's organization, and looking at working with edtech organizations to help them get better at accessing customers and school districts in the US. So yeah, over to you, Alison, and we'll go and introduce ourselves, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Hi, I am Allison Crean Davis. I am a vice president at WestAT in their education studies practice, and WestAT is a large government research organization that has many different sectors beyond education, but I work in education. One of the major projects that I lead is called the National Comprehensive Center. It's funded by through the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and we do a lot of work to support capacity building in our state education agencies, who then support districts and schools to improve what they're doing in outcomes for kids.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Burns. I'm the Chief Research Officer at the National Center on Education and the Economy in Washington, D.C. We work to sort of benchmark practices from around the world in order to surprise, delight, provoke, and allow people to think differently about how things might be done here in the U.S. Today I'll be speaking a lot about the international perspective, and that most of my career was spent internationally at the OECD in Paris. So look to me for international examples. National come from. I'm the expert there.
Hi everyone, I'm Vijay Perincheri. I'm a co-founder and the chief scientist of an organization called Discourse Analytics. Primarily we focus on the non-cognitive attributes of students, essentially what helps people grow, the learner journeys, and what are the key attributes that drive it. So we essentially engage with students, increasing their engagement with their learning pathways, and identify what personal approach works with who kind of an approach. I'm really interested in macro impacts and micro impacts, essentially how they can be brought in together. Looking forward to this discussion, actually. It's great.
So I'll set the stage for this conversation. And the reason we set this out, beyond learning outcomes, because there's an underlying belief that at least I came up with when I invested in companies over the last 15 years in education, that we, by measuring only learning outcomes improvement, are missing out a bigger picture. And give you an example. We invested in a company in Vietnam called MindX. It's a coding teaching company, teaches coding, AI, machine learning to children from the age of 8 to the age of 18. And they were not getting a lot of success in getting students to show up. Then they ended up realizing a lot of their first few centers that they set up outside school were empty. So they started renting out the space to startups for cheap. And startup founders would sit in the corner, do the thing, work, and children would come and learn, and the centers were filling out slowly until they created an interaction between the startup founders and the children and their parents. So while they were trying to solve and talk about how their product, their pedagogy, their teachers were amazing, I wasn't getting the attention of the parents to convert to customers. What was missing was a social issue. Many countries, parents of 40 years of age or 45 years of age, have experienced the benefit of computer science, of AI, in their own careers. So when they go home, they take it for granted when the children tell them, oh, I want to be a computer science engineer. The parents can talk specificities with them. Parents can mentor them, guide them. Vietnam doesn't have that. This current parent batch of young children have not benefited from computer science in their careers. So the mentorship they provide to their children is rather limited. So they rather push their children towards, no, you got to learn English. And English is the solver for everything. So you'll see a lot of spend in Vietnam towards English, very little towards computer science. What we solved for with this company was that the mentors, the people who had benefited from computer science, were now mentoring parents to tell them why computer science is the basis for such a great life-changing career opportunity. So the company now has been super successful. It's a leading player in the country because they solve for the social challenge of enabling parents to learn about the value of computer science as a curriculum. It wasn't education quality that was the reason why students wouldn't show up. It was the parent education quality in that domain that was the reason. So that was a trigger of many triggers which enabled us to think about the fact that we could theoretically expand the narrative around impact, what we measure, so that when we look for success and failure of an education system, we measure it across various elements, social elements. So the summary of it is that education is a great social problem, and often it cannot be solved in isolation from other social triggers and challenges. You got to solve it more holistically. And that was the takeaway, and that's the basis for this session. So please, it's a workshop, opine, contribute, participate. We've got 3 experts. Alison, you're going to get started with your examples and lessons and life around EdTech and education measurement, outcomes measurement, etc.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think I will start by just reflecting a little bit on the title, Beyond Learning Outcomes. I've actually just, do you ever have like your talking points down at a conference and then you go to a session and you're like, I'm going to totally change because something you just heard. So I'm just coming out of a session that's got me a little bit fired up about talking about learning outcomes. So there's a little bit of a trend, at least in the United States, to kind of talk about, you know, standardized testing and eliminating that and how it's so, you know, limiting to our students and not a helpful tool. So what I would start out by saying is that assessments and the metrics and the feedback loop that they provide to us in education help us understand outcomes and impact. They answer specific questions we have about students. And no one assessment, no one metric will tell us everything. That's why it's important for us to start with what are the questions we have about students that relate to impact, what do we care about, and then how do we design a system of measures around us to give us the feedback that we need to do our jobs well and the best we can to serve students. So outcomes, at least in the United States, tend to be around academic achievement. And it's become more sophisticated over time. It's really a rather new requirement. It's in the last 25 years, really, in this country, that states are required to use specific outcomes and report those on a federal level and disaggregate those outcomes by different kinds of students or different demographics of students, boys and girls, and different ethnic backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds, et cetera. Why? Because there are inequities. There are systemic and historic inequities in outcomes in this country. So outcomes matter to hold our systems accountable. And the other thing I'll say about certain outcomes like kindergarten readiness, being able to read on grade level by 3rd grade, mastering algebra by 8th grade, graduating high school, going to post-secondary, these are all predictors. The science, the research has said, if students pass these gateways at certain points in time, critical points in time in their development, it is a sign of good things to come down the road, including all the way to economic thriving and wellness and avoiding detrimental outcomes like going to jail. Literally 3rd grade reading is a predictor of economic outcomes and staying out of jail. So there's a reason we measure these things and that our systems are held accountable. Do they tell us everything? No. So as Sandeep said, our educational systems function within larger ecosystems that are all related to educational outcomes: food and nutrition, transportation, housing, healthcare. All of these things relate to wellness and ability to learn in schools. So I think what's exciting about the time we're in is we're with sort of big data and machine learning and the ability to join all different data sets together, we can hopefully better understand what's happening in school and how it may be impacted by some of these other sectors that surround schools and children. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we're short on time, but maybe we'll get back to it, is there's also a whole ecosystem within a child. So in addition to student achievement, it's also important to understand other predictors of success, like motivation, a sense of purpose, self-discipline, persistence, all of these different social emotional or non-cognitive variables, people call them different things, are related to achievement. And our systems aren't as well set up to measure those things, but we do know that they matter.
Thanks. And absolutely. I think one of the things when we explore sort of what's happening with outcomes and what do we think about new ways of measuring impact, we often take the achievement piece for granted, right? So the call, or at least as far as I'm concerned, the call is not, let's throw all of our measurements for how well a kid reads out the window. It's more about what else is happening. Let's not forget to say it, though. And so I'll just very briefly, what I'll do is sort of talk through a few things that are emerging internationally, which do take place here in the U.S., but in a much more scattered way. What I'm talking about are national or jurisdiction-wide initiatives. And just to help us parse it briefly, we can call them things around the what's being tested, how do we understand what we care about. You're going to speak more about that, so I won't go into too much detail, but this potentially false dichotomy between what counts as a learning outcome and what are the other skills that systems care about is a really big trend. Another one is the how, right? So EdTech in particular opens up a whole bunch of affordances for how we want to think about what students are doing and what we can understand by not just whether they get the right answer or not, but the strategies they use when they're figuring out or solving a problem, the steps they use, the perseverance they might have, and increasingly understanding ways to track through online tech, not just their own individual achievement, but collaborative achievement. If we think about what we expect students to know and do to succeed in the world, a lot of it is also thinking about, well, what's useful for later life? What's useful in a job? What's useful to make friends and keep friends and raise families? And those have a lot to do with collective skills. And increasingly, we have ways to actually track that and measure that, which is really interesting and fun to dig down into. There's a why. Alison just talked about it, but why are we testing things and what do we want to understand? What's the purpose of it? Sometimes it's about understanding deeper learning, right? Korea has this very interesting math program it's an AI program called TalkTalk. I don't think there's any kind of copyright infringement, but it's really to personalize and help kids understand and dig down into their math work. Whereas Singapore is something which is really helping them, kids use, this is AI again, but it's helping them with English lessons think about and correct grammar, punctuation, things like that, which frees up the teacher to be able to help the child or the student with narrative, with themes, with more difficult subjects. But the teacher isn't correcting grammar, etc. So there's a why. Why are we using and measuring different things, and what is the purpose of that? There's a who. You mentioned this. Part of it is thinking about parents, right? What is the role of students in thinking about what matters to them? And if we're thinking about learning outcomes, are the students involved in being able to understand and dictate that? In Ireland, they're doing that even for the youngest students, even in preschool. They're trying to get them involved in self-reflection and thinking about, well, what matters to me and how do I want to understand if I've met my learning goals? They're thinking about how to bring in parents, students, the communities. In British Columbia, they really work heavily with the First Nations to make sure that it's related to the community and anchored in the territory that's there. In industry and labor needs, we heard a lot of that already in the previous session, just thinking about, well, what actually is not just sort of amorphous what you need to know at work, but what about your local community and what about your local jobs? And all of these things will dictate the kind of measurements you set up. I'll stop there, but know that and hope we can come back to the what and where and when, because there's a lot of cool stuff happening all over the world. Over to you.
Thank you. Actually, it was interesting to listen to all three viewpoints in terms of the impacts of society on education and vice versa. I mean, it's a totally symbiotic system. Society impacts education, who gets opportunities, who gets benefits and all that. And education sets up the framework for the society of the future. Recently, I came across some statistics from the Department of Labor economist, economic research, as well as LinkedIn economic graph. I don't know if you've come across that. The estimates there range from 50 to 70% of the jobs that would exist in 2035 do not even exist today, which almost suggests that the content you learn or you teach is almost irrelevant. It's the art of learning that we have to train our students on. How do they actually find out what is needed? Because the future, there was a time when the skills you possess is what drives your contribution to the society. Now it is adaptation. How can you adapt to the new skills that are required for tomorrow? And these things are changing all the time. And technology is changing, and that gives us not only challenges but opportunities. So the impact then becomes, can educational institutions actually nurture this capacity to learn, the art of learning? Can you create that? This goes back to what Alison was referring to in terms of self-confidence, motivation, and their resilience. How do they actually attack problems? What do they do in terms of solving this? And do they, today we are in a world where our digital footprints are so large that there is a digital footprint for everything we do. Can we leverage that in a constructive way rather than selling them things and putting advertisements and tweets on them? Can we leverage it in a way that we can start understanding students and their pathways in a way that helps them individually? Today, some of the big concerns in higher eds where I work primarily with is the use of ChatGPT for essay writing, and they're trying to figure out how can we find out plagiarism. And I feel like there is a huge opportunity that is missed. We leverage that to actually help people get where they want, individualized. Each person can have their own strength. And can we use it that way so that the future needs, that the industry needs, or the society at large needs, adaptation, can we leverage students to do that? So in terms of moving the measurements from grading students based on what they know toward figuring out how we can help them get there. And I'm looking forward to a total discussion here, and we can discuss specific things that we are all working on. We did a sort of an informal survey, if you will, as a part of our work with students, with teachers in high school and colleges. And it was interesting that 50 to 60% of the teachers' time is spent on, it's not a true time in motion studies or anything, but setting exam papers, correcting them, grading students. It's that proportion of time is spent on grading, rather than the actual purpose of an exam or a test is identifying what is lacking, how can you help them get where they want to. That calibration is what is missing. Can we actually leverage all these measurements towards calibrating, towards enabling a pathway forward? And that is what I think the opportunities are.
Oh, that's great. I think we've come to a natural point where we can involve the audience in a workshop-like discussion, because this is what it is. An example that could spur the conversation could be, you are looking to measure an outcome of your own company's value to whoever your customer is. We can start discussing that, see what do you do, what are you trying to measure, what's your take on what you measure and why you do it, and we can go from there as a brainstorming opportunity. So anyone can come up with a thought, talk about their work, and go for it. I'm looking at you, right through you. Do you want to come up here? Yeah, thank you. That's a logistical matter. Please come up, and so we can get you recorded as well.
And if anybody cannot stand, I will.
Hi again. My name is Jamila from Smart Girls Uganda. I was just really thinking about what you're talking about involving parents, and with the work we do with through our Girls with Tools, where we train them in male-dominated skills. We had a very big issue because the status quo, challenging status quo, having girls like Muslim girls getting into these fields, and we are really working with out of school vulnerable women who are already teenage pregnant and they're in very early marriages, so they wouldn't be sent to school to our skill center to learn. But later we noticed just using digital knowledge sharing, the coolness about she's a plumber and she's still veiled and she's working, the digital awareness around TikTok and Instagram, like remove the barriers around the skill sets, and it attracted them to come much more. But also having like men engagement days at the skill center, like invite your spouses to see what you're learning, the skills that you're learning, really actually created more, broke the barriers, and then they could allow them to enroll much more in the skill sets. As simple as the fact that later we noticed just skilling only the girls wasn't making sense, so we do 80% girls and 20% boys to make the boys be the voices for that it's possible to work with these girls in these fields. So it was really amazing. So I really wanted to measure more impact around my involving the boys, the 20% men, young men, in the skills that are teaching these young women, how it has broken the barriers and broken the status quo when it comes to training these young women in these more male-dominated, non-traditional skill sets, but also challenging them to be innovative and creative around. We find that some of my girls have started a company that is making tools, and they're using ChatGPT on how to become creative. And this is like electrical engineering. And then one is wondering, they should be traditional. So I'm trying to measure more impact in how I'm breaking barriers and, creating more coolness in these skill sets. Thank you.
That's amazing. So I think I'll just see the thought process here because I could. The idea that you repeated many times, the word was breaking barriers. And in a typical investor thought process, if they're looking at this as an investable proposition, because I'm an investor at heart, I would imagine that I could look at one of two ways. One is to say, okay, I'll look at the improvement of outcomes. How skilled were you? How skilled are you? That's one way of being very microscopic and tactical about measuring an outcome of the work that you do. The other is to look at, were you able to create a sense of breaking the barrier of access to services, social services, that men or males enjoyed more than women or females, right? So I think without getting into a measurement technique around it, but that would be an amazing measurement later in the future where you could say, okay, we could bring parity or equity. And that would have a greater impact, perhaps, than just measuring outcome improvement through measuring skill improvement. Were you a good engineer? Were you a great engineer? Now, great, but did you change society? That's one way to think about social connection to what you're providing, which is very deep.
I have a clarification. Is this Uganda-wide or in Kampala or?
It's Uganda-wide.
Uganda-wide, okay. Okay, yeah. So then just adding, and this is also meant for other people to join in as well. It's just because we have mics, it's easier, but please. Yeah. I think there's, building on what Sandeep said, I think there's a few opportunities to think both in terms of short-term and medium-term impacts, right? So you can talk about number of students you have, you can talk about number of graduates, number of people who get jobs. You can do attitude surveys, actually, of course, both for themselves, but also for their families, maybe in their workplaces, their clients. Those would be all things you could track changes over time. And you could also, if you look at the 20% boys, you could think about when they get jobs, not just whether their attitudes are changing, but are they reaching out to work with the girls that they trained with, right? Are they very comfortable connecting with those partners? Do you see that sort of solidifying the relationships and the networks? And you can do that both in the short term, but also in a sort of 2-year, depending on how long your cycle is. But you could do it in a 2 and even longer year if you really want to make a strong argument for not just immediate sort of first degree change, but you're talking about breaking barriers, as Sandeep said, but you're talking about shifting a culture, right? You're talking about actually opening up and challenging societal norms against gender, against religion, against occupation. I mean, this is a major change in not just behavior, but also mindset. And thinking of ways, I mean, it depends on how ambitious you want to be and obviously also what any investor is willing to fund. But you could actually imagine designing a really beautiful impact analysis, or even a sort of what is that called? Natural experiment, where you're actually able to track what's happening and what's changing over time in a very meaningful way. And you could probably get funding for that actually from philanthropy.
Yeah.
For that one, yeah.
Yeah, that evolution toward including 20% boys, that was a brilliant thinking. I think it's great. It's not only about pushing towards a resistant force, but essentially weakening the resistance too by helping the other side. That's remarkable. I think it's great.
One thing we talked about earlier today when we were kind of doing some prep for this session was the importance of knowing context. And what I heard from you was that you had a good sense of what that barrier could be. And by being able to describe that, you were then able to solve for it and sort of try something and see that it worked. And then the other thing I heard from you, I think, was that, so that was sort of a strategic, very strategic, and it worked out well. And then you also had the element of surprise with the social media and the cool factor, as you described it, which was kind of like, oh. So I think it's what's kind of intriguing to me, I don't have the answer, but something to maybe probe is what you did with the boys is removed a barrier. And then what you're seeing with the social media or the TikTok and all that stuff is almost an accelerant in a way. So it's one, removing the barrier, and the other is how do we push the gas on this cool factor. It may not matter for every single person participating, but there may be some kids who would not stay without that cool factor. So better understanding what that is and how to really, I guess, accelerate and encourage that for the kids that need it is super exciting.
Okay, so it's back to me now. Anybody else wants to talk? Participate?
Thank you for sharing,
Yeah.
by the way. It was being brave.
It's a lot of courage, but please
All
go
right,
for it.
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Z, and I would like to share about what Mr. Perincherry said about the ChatGPT in education. So from a personal perspective, I did my undergrad in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we all know the public universities in, let's say, in Holland, in Germany, in France. They were, so let's say their faculty student ratio was not pretty ideal if we compare to the US. Mm-hmm. So I think you mentioned the use of ChatGPT in education, and so I mean normally it was viewed as a pretty negative thing because people would think the students get more lazy, they are not willing to think, they just use ChatGPT to generate some responses. But I mean, I'm born 2001, and growing up and doing my uni in such environment, I think ChatGPT actually helped us how to cope with, or let's say how to blend in the let's say first the academic writing, because there were not enough resources to tutor everyone how to do proper academic writing, because traditionally we have to look at all the writing books. I think for PhDs there are multiple manuals you can take reference of. However, at bachelor or at master level, not really many resources are offered. So that's my first point. And the second one, I would like to share a little cat and rat race in the unis. So basically, students are trying their best to use ChatGPT to generate their essay with as higher mark as possible, while preventing getting caught from the uni. And yeah. I'm serious. And such process is actually, let's say, a kind of working sample for their future career. Because as we see, I mean, if we compare their work, if they really pay some time and effort in prompt engineering, and because I mean, there's a background. If you generate your essay fully using AI, definitely 100% you are gonna get caught. So there is a balance, or where you can fill in the gap with your expertise and also kind of get prepared for your future career. And I think that's where our true ability to use these AI tools get enhanced. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So well said.
Yeah, in fact, that's a very good set of observations in terms of using AI tools in general, right? I mean, there are many ways of not getting caught. It's like there is a whole science behind it. I mean, we have these things where you use concepts of RAG to basically make sure that the essay that you write is very different from the essay that she writes, primarily because I'll feed some documents to basically index it on. So it's all doable. But one of the things that we are actually working on now with the OpenAI group is actually interesting in the sense of we look at all these behavioral signals of students and create sort of profiles of a student, saying, this person who is actually very confident and want to actually do this, very motivated, or another person might actually have a low resilience and all that kind of a stuff. And then craft the response from OpenAI or ChatGPT, which is tailored to that personality. So in the sense that GPT can answer the question, but can it read the room? It's always been the question, right? So make it sort of adaptive, which means you can have the old, Socratic learning, if you will. I can learn my way. And that's the advantage in these things, essentially being able to leverage it for helping rather than, unfortunately, there is a little bit of a cat and mouse thing, as you said. There's because these are questioning traditional approaches. It's not technology always comes up with something new, and the educational system, which is sort of focused on grading students, have to catch up. But that'll change slowly and steadily. I think it's great.
I think Z, you pointed out one skill which is pretty important. So when I deal with my own kids, one of them goes to college, and one of them is trying to go to college, writing college essays right now. She's obviously using ChatGPT, and it's okay. And I think a lot of students do. Some use paid services. The point of this is that I don't really mind if my students, if I were a teacher, use ChatGPT to write all their essays. Go for it. What I would look at is their prompt journey. Now, what I would look for is number of prompts they asked. Did they ask one prompt and stop? Yeah, D. Did they ask 5 prompts and get into depth about engineering a thought process that shows progression and logic that they're following, which shows to me that they're curious and learning more through prompt management? And what feedback they get from the system, they come up with another prompt, which is even more interesting. I would look at the prompts. How many? How clever? And do they improve in quality? Do they have a thesis? Because unless in life, in anything, investing, any job, you have a hypothesis, you will not go anywhere. So can this student independently develop a hypothesis? And is that hypothesis visible through the prompts that they follow? That, to me, is a hireable skill. Because knowledge or information is out there. Can you bring it out in a manner that is the best knowledge that you can bring to me as a partner, to me as an employee? That's amazing. If you just ask one question, yeah, well, you're lazy. So I think...
So submit the number of prompts along
yeah,
with that, you mean?
Submit the number of prompts, submit all the prompts and how you arrived at your essay.
Yeah.
Because that will be amazing. Then I can propel students.
Right.
What does McKinsey do in an interview, right?
Oh,
what do they do? They make you ask them questions.
The approach.
They don't ask.
Exactly.
They don't ask you questions, right? They make you say, okay, what next? How will you do? How would you measure that? How would you do this? And you got to come up with thoughts and logic and rationale on the spot, which tells you, do you have the curiosity? Then can I ask you the right question? Say, okay, BJ, you are interviewing me. Help me understand. If you're asking me to measure this, how many things exist of this type in the world. So I'm really interviewing you, my interviewer, and that gets you to hire me.
Yeah.
So that is what ChatGPT does in an isolated form.
I'd like to build on that. I feel like we're drifting a bit from impact. But,
Sorry.
Well, no, but I love it. So I wanted to build on that in the sense that talking about all the different skill sets that are shown, and it's a bit of a pity that it becomes cat and mouse, because it implies that there is something that is untruthful happening, right? Which in fact, for many academic institutions, it still is. I mean, there isn't a very clear process for what you declare and how you declare it, and it's all too new. So those institutions haven't necessarily responded very well. But imagining a future where it becomes a bit clearer, then you can not only investigate prompts, but you might just have some kind of disclosure, like, I use these tools for these purposes, and then I did this other thing. I mean, that's just it's an accepted and normalized part of what you're doing. And part of that, I think, speaks to another quality which employers value highly, but so do humans in general, which is honesty. Right? We had this conversation, this is 2 years ago at CCSSO summer convening, where somebody was saying, if I can use ChatGPT to generate something, I'm going to hire that guy. I don't care what he does. If he can do it in 20 seconds, I'm going to always hire him. And the table I was sitting at was a whole bunch of chiefs, superintendents, and they were like, are you kidding me? I would never hire somebody I couldn't trust. Because it was about whether somebody would cheat to do it or whether or not they would tell you that, And so it was this thing of like, for those people who were employers, they were like, yeah, sure, use whatever tool, but tell me you're using it. And that's the person I'm going to hire, versus somebody who might magic something up in 20 seconds, but actually pretend that they had done it in a different way. So I think it touches on a number of very interestingly different domains of skills and what we care about, not just as for what education gives for work, but also for life in general.
Yeah, you could measure integrity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. Okay, we are out of thoughts.
No, actually,
Thank you. You have to come here.
Hi. Just on that point, so I work at a college with undergraduate students mostly, who then go on to work with K through 12 students in various mentoring and education capacities. I'm definitely, I think, more of a AI in the classroom skeptic, I would say. And to the point about measuring integrity, and I think you made a point, Vijay, about measuring things like self-confidence and moral courage. Those feel like very sort of analog, almost anachronistic skills that used to be highly valued and taught as part of the moral education in mostly institutions of higher education, post-secondary. And so I'm wondering now if we're kind of like returning to the origin in a way, and are there tools and data that are going to help us measure integrity, self-confidence better than just a person knowing another person? And those very like one-on-one relationships and seeing students go through, whatever cycle of education that you're witnessing. So that's my question, and something we're struggling with at my institution.
I'm not allowed to pitch, right? I mean, but so that's yeah. In fact, one of the things we are working, I wouldn't say we have the tools, but we are working on those kind of measurements, essentially using all the behavioral signals we get from across the campus and across all the learning management system interactions and all that. And, over the last 8 years, about 7.5 million individual interactions later. I mean, we have this sort of mapping out those kind of things. I mean, that's still a work in progress, identifying what could this student be facing, what could this student actually benefit on, and things of that sort. So that's definitely toward a sort of a personalized learning pathway kind of a thing. Yes, and that's what I wish all institutions start essentially thinking in those directions to actually help that kind of a growth at a student level. One of the things that I was going to ask also, Sandeep, on that thing is, the educational systems don't reflect the dynamic shifts that is happening in the industry. There is a shadow price that the industry is paying for it through training needs, through retention problems. from an investment standpoint, as an investor, I mean, how would we actually leverage that shadow price down to tools that help institutions make these investments at the student level? You know, that's one of those things that is constantly
you
a
even
challenge.
want that. You really want institutions to teach the employable, the current, I don't know, it's a
Right.
question, honestly.
Yeah.
Because the first thing that comes to my mind is, do I even want it? Right? I don't know, I'm not sure yet, because our institutions best placed to teach the deep job skills to, and the future ready skills to students when they are themselves focused on reinventing themselves, but employers are dealing with real world challenges
Yeah.
at the same time. So how much of that shadow cost needs to be in the system and needs to be absorbed by the employers so that they can really have a more effective, shorter interaction with the students,
Yeah.
whereas institutions will spend much longer and waste more capital? I don't know.
Yeah.
So should we specialize a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, some of those big impacts, the measurements that are known, statistics that are not as talked about, are in the U.S. Average U.S. college graduation rate is 57%, which means 43% of the students who join college drop out. And a more interesting fact is that 69% of the so-called $1 trillion outstanding college debt is owed by dropouts, with no resource to pay it back, right? So these are real impacts on the society. And how can we leverage to make sure these things are addressed in terms of retention, in terms of engagement, in terms of adaptability? And can you actually create that lifelong learner pathway that, you know, the old concept of 4 years in my campus, space-time, that's a lifelong relationship, that is gone. I mean, these days, that pathway is gone. It's like everybody is learning everything every other time. And institutions are not the ones you actually look at the way as a place to go and learn from. If I graduated from a college when I'm in a bank, and 5 years from now, cryptocurrency, that I should know about it. I mean, it will become mandated. I should think about my university as the way to go and get it from. But universities are not tuned that way. So how can we actually create sort of impact measurements that really value everything that institutions do, and how society's needs are reflected? I mean, that'll change the dynamics. I mean, this is a part that we all have to think through.
I'd like to make a comment on the measurement itself. And sorry, Alison, I didn't mean to cut you off. But your point is a very good one, and it's a philosophical question, and I think it's also a measurement question, which is a very real one. There is a huge amount of work being done trying to think of measurements of whatever you want to call them, non-cognitive, social, emotional, whatever that category is. There are tests and there are measurements. The OECD has them for 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds, also for 5-year-olds. And so that is a major set of efforts. One of the real measurement challenges is not only are they often contextualized, but unlike math or reading, where the higher you score, the better, right? Your aim on any math exam is to get 100%. You don't want to be 100% on self-confidence. Yeah. We all know that guy. Nobody likes that guy. You know what I mean? Like, trust, like, you know, there's a norm. Some of it's cultural, some of it's contextual, but there's not a right answer. So finding a measurement that hits that sweet spot of what is the right level of self-confidence, but not that annoying level of self-confidence, and vice versa, that's more than that's a measurement challenge, but it's also a much bigger challenge about trying to understand what combination of things works. And your question about, like, does it do a better job than just a kind of an old-fashioned analog way? I mean, for some of these traits, I'm a measurement person. I love all these things. I love thinking about them. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just want to meet somebody and then you get a sense, as opposed to what does this score mean for me about those kinds of traits. But I think it's a really interesting point.
I was just going to add one more. It's a very fine-grained answer to the question you asked about integrity or truthfulness. So this is where, education outcomes may borrow from other disciplines. So my background before working in this space is actually in clinical psychology. So I have a lot of expertise and training in assessment, psychological assessment. And many psychological assessments have factors built in called lie scales. So, and they'll ask certain kinds of questions. They're looking for reliability from the, one time you answered to another. They're also looking for people saying, no, I would never do something like that, on things that like 99% of the population would say, yes, I did that. It's almost like presenting a false self. And so, I mean, gets super specific, but there are ways to assess for that are probably imperfect and flawed, but, over time have stood the test of time. And they may be biased, especially in different, cultures and things like that. So I'm not saying that's a perfect answer, but there are, people have tried to measure that.
But these kind of measurements are, sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to fight back with what he said, which is that, do we trust business to test whether or not our humans, our corporate citizens are the humans that we want to have? And I would argue that if we could just work really hard on the academy and on education, that this is an investment worth making. Sure. Because business is even more short-term oriented and has become incredibly addicted to the idea of the hire and fire world rather than the reinvest world. So that social change is much bigger than helping some high schools and some college instructors learn how to think about personalization of education, learn how to include a mix of cognitive and social skills in an assessment of a human. Again, I don't know if we want to get as creepy as doing a full psych scan on everybody, because that data could follow you some really horrible places. But I do think that we could be a much bigger about what's worth investing in measuring what matters in the school, because I think that's the place where many humans get left behind, and we don't have to do that. We could do that investment.
Fully agree with that. Our businesses are notorious, right? When governments in 300 years ago gave businesses the freedom to do trading, they went and colonized half the world to do trading, which that's how the stuff started. But I fully agree. I think businesses are short-sighted. Academia can be longer-sighted, so there has to be more collaboration, and then we fall apart because we don't know how to collaborate. So we shall see. But I really like what you said. Thank you. So, okay, how much time do we have?
We still have like
10, 15 minutes? Good. So I have a question for thought process. And a lot of you deal with edtech products, right? And this is a philosophical thought process for you to think through and reflect and answer. I'm still struggling with it because I don't know how to answer it, and the panel will as well have different answers to it. When an investor looks at an edtech product, they look at, from the entrepreneur's perspective, engagement. Now imagine a child engaged on an edtech product, on a digital device. What does it do to you? Do I want 2 hours of engagement, which the investor wants? Or that the parent wants 15 minutes? The child is addicted now. He's got dopamine coming from the device nonstop. What is the right answer to this engagement question? The investor is super happy. The family is not happy anymore. So it's a question that I struggle with philosophically.
I guess I would say engagement is a metric that really depends on the objective. What is the purpose of that tool or that technology? If it's for learning, some things can be learned in 30 seconds. And so 30 seconds would be the right metric for engagement if you then had some sort of indicator in the technology that like learning happened, some sort of feedback that, yes, this person got it, and now we're on to the next thing. So, I mean, it just feels like that kind of duration should vary, but it feels like a very blunt instrument for trying to assess impact.
So this is one of my hats, so you may regret answering this question or asking this question. I mean, there's a huge amount of work being done on child rights in a digital environment, and what do we actually think about sort of not just human-centered design, but child-centered design, right? And the regulatory space behind that. And so one of the conversations is not just about what does engagement mean, but what does learning mean? What's the purpose of the EdTech product? Your purchaser, I mean, if your purchaser is the parent, your purchaser is the school, your purchaser is somebody who's making a choice which hopefully will be based on quality, whether or not you deliver, whether or not you're compliant with the variety of regulations which are set out in the States. It's COPPA or FERPA, or there's various versions all over the world. But all of those are designed to try and keep, at least theoretically, the child's best interests at heart. And children themselves are involved in the process, right? They themselves are involved at talking about what values to them and what they want to see in a product and how it can be designed with their needs in mind. And so I think one of the big calls, or at least that conversation, is not just is getting beyond engagement, but thinking about, if you really are in the EdTech space, think about who your client is, what you're trying to achieve, and what this means not just for sort of immediate short-term gain, but longer-term building of trust, and the number of certifications that are going to be cropping up around whether or not you're FERPA compliant or COPPA compliant and various other things, whether or not you've taken this to heart and you've co-designed with kids and have the safety mechanisms, safety by design, all that stuff, whether or not you protect the data that they're giving you, because there are a lot of, including emotional data that's being shared. Those are things that I'm hopeful will eventually be able to be used also in purchasing decisions. Yeah. So it then becomes a sort of virtuous cycle of how do you drive sort of evolving this in a positive way rather than simply going for the quick and easy dollars with the dopamine hit.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's like the engagement becomes a sort of a leading indicator. I mean, that's the way people look at it. It's not because people want engagement, but engagement is the easiest thing to measure, right? So if you think in terms of any tasks that you get people to do, there is a direct effect, and then there is an outcome. Outcome leads to returns. Returns leads to the impact. So I feel like, when we invest in these measurements at different points, what is always missing is the gap between the two. There is a law of diminishing marginal returns in everything. So after some time, the engagement doesn't actually help get the outcome. Mm-hmm. Can we, similarly, the outcome, does it actually create the impact that is required, right? And that's where I think one of the big investments is the general ROI measurements, if you will. We have to start investing in that. What kind of a sort of what do you call it, a penetration of the community creates this outcome? After some time, it's law of diminishing marginal returns. Do we need to actually invest so much into it? I think that's another area of this. ROI is another area of impact measurements that really should drive that.
Good classroom.
Awesome. You have a hand over here.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that question. I'm interested for the panel to comment a little bit on, so it seems that engagement is a measure of a certain goal. And talking about measurement without talking about the goal that you're trying to achieve is a missed opportunity. Right. And so, that might be something that an investor is interested in from a monetization, but if you're investing in ed tech, is that the right goal to be measuring against? And so making sure that we're looking at measurement and impact, we're taking into consideration the goal and how, who do you see doing a good job of that, and what are the goals other than, kind of the return that investors are looking at that we could be looking at? Is it, speed that they're learning? Is it, people using, students using this compared to students not, where they're exiting the grade with? Why aren't we kind of considering some of those as part of it?
Fully agree with that. So one of the reasons I asked that question is exactly what you brought up, the goal. And this is the whole track is learning and investing. That's the whole purpose. I brought those two circles together. The point of it is that when you as an entrepreneur, if there are any entrepreneurs in the room, talk to investors, you need to train them in how to think about engagement, how to think about what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve, because investors will go for the top 3 metrics. They are generalists. generally speaking. And better guidance from you right up top, this is what I'm trying to achieve in my pitch book, is deeper than just improving engagement, is deeper than just driving learning outcomes. It's about social change, and that achieved through this goal measurement is something that I often see lacking in the pitches that come through. So, but generally, engagement is right up there. The number of questions answered there is right up there. Answered correctly, that improves. The right-hand graph goes up over time, yes. But other things which are more important don't show up. So anyway, those are things we think through. So yeah, we have 5 minutes to wrap up. Love to have others sort of come in and chime in with other thoughts and questions. One more at least. Please end the day positively. I think it's been really fun.
It's positive, I thought, no?
Yeah.
I know you're asking that. Can I say one
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
Sorry. That I think one thing that I'm taking from what you're saying that we talk a lot about when we talk about impact is you can have a discrete outcome from your product or service that is very important. And so you can say sort of what happened, like more kids are reading on grade level, it happened more quickly and that sort of thing. And that's really important. And I would imagine it would be also very compelling to then say, what's the so what behind that? It's not just what happened, what's the so what? Why is it important that this many more kids were reading on third grade? And again, you can say, well, the evidence says when more kids can do X, Y, and Z, it predicts that later on, all A, B, and C, all these other great outcomes are going to happen. And I think that's, there's a lot of evidence in the education space of what predicts the next best thing for that student in their trajectory. There's something called cradle to career outcomes. Maybe some of you have heard of those. Those are all predictors of an arc of development. So I think helping folks to see how a more discrete measure actually can predict very long-term positive outcomes is a compelling story that you can begin to tell too.
So why did this come about? I'm frustrated with the fact that education as a sector doesn't attract a lot of capital compared to others, such as health, such as climate change. So I have a very naive theory, and it's important. Everything is very important, but education is a solid change agent, and it is underinvested. So one of the theories is that with the impact of climate change is so visible, it really hurts you when a fire breaks out or a flood happens. The impact of education or the lack of it is invisible, so slow. And humans are terrible at noticing slow change. We only perceive fast change and we get attracted to the emotional rush from it and we put capital behind that. Very simplistic. How do we bring more emotions from us? And how do we become ambassadors of the fact that we can tell that education has a deeper impact, longer term impact, more positive and more negative impact than it's visible through an image of children in a classroom?